What is a technology cluster?
Yeah, it's at a very basic level, sort of a close-knit group of really smart people working together, not necessarily in like one specific company. Maybe actually it's better to start with an example. Silicon Valley is like the canonical example of like a technology cluster. You have tens of thousands of technology startups there. You have a whole ecosystem of venture capitalists. You have research fellows at nearby universities that sort of work with a lot of these technologists. And so that sort of, it's an ecosystem of innovators, entrepreneurs, really smart technical engineers, finance that has a lot of the managerial skills that these people lack, and then also sort of like a research angle. And when you put all of those people in sort of close quarters and there's lots of interaction between the two of them, and then you start to see like the fruits of that interaction, that is a tech cluster.
So it's basically like economies of scale. Is that a fair interpretation?
Yeah, sort of, or amalgamation effects that, yeah, sort of the combination is more than the sum of its parts. If you were to take each of these individual tech cluster or tech companies and say, what are they adding? All of them individually are not producing as much as sort of the combination of people being able to, leave Google and go start a company. But because of their time at Google, they had connections with, a certain VC that was able to then, find them an awesome co-founder that they wouldn't have found otherwise, So all of those sort of social relationships.
Which is not dissimilar from what happens in DC either.
Right.
A lot of
Yeah.
cities are really built on these relationships. And we just had Stephen Hamilton on from GWU, and what we talked about was how the coronavirus pandemic is going to kind of impact that.
Yeah.
Because you can't have these in-person, one-to-one interactions that are so valuable in these powerful cities across the country and around the world.
Definitely, yeah. Which I think is one interesting aspect of this coronavirus crisis is that it's sort of like an exogenous shock to social norms. It's suddenly disrupting the way that we typically do things, and I think frequently technology and social technologies or like hierarchies tend to sort of evolve in tandem, but you can frequently have path dependency where you kind of get stuck down one route, and maybe we've been doing one thing inefficiently for so long that it kind of seems infeasible to change because you need such coordination between the actors to all switch to this new equilibrium. That even though coronavirus is obviously a tragedy and awful, there might be some silver lining in the fact that maybe it helps us shake up our social equilibriums and see if there's new ones that are better.
Yeah, we were talking about that in relation to like healthcare,
Yeah.
which I thought was interesting. Of like not healthcare, education. Of like there is like very much an equilibrium in education of like professor teaches a class, the classes do homework alone, you have teacher assistants and all that kind of stuff. And the point Stephen made was about like superstar professors. Like what if we had these like really great professors who were great at getting a message across, teaching classes of hundreds of students online, and then they paired off
Yeah.
to like talk with assistant professors and professors who might not be as like teaching savvy, but like have really great knowledge to help people in like specialized areas. So I have no idea if that's going to be the equilibrium after we leave this, but I think
Yeah. Yeah.
it is interesting that this is going to force us to test some models I think we've been suggesting and thinking about, and now this crisis is kind of like thrust upon us.
Yeah, I think a lot will probably depend on how long it goes on. I mean, if we're looking at just a couple of weeks or even like a month or two, that's probably not going to do much in the long term. But there's very wide error bars on how long this sort of broad social distancing could continue to go on, and if it does go on 6 months or longer, then at some point reach a tipping point where it makes sense to invest in the fixed costs that then make a lot of these technologies viable, or set up new internal infrastructures, not only technologically but also socially, to actually make these kinds of things work. So I think that will be very interesting to see kind of what happens there. I think it's not only on the superstar professor side of things, but also again, if we're thinking about coordination costs, individual students, like part of what they're buying with their degree is the sort of social acceptance that you did a good thing and signaled to the rest of society that you can do all these things competently. But so long as sort of online education continues to have the slight stigma attached to it that like, oh no, that's not actually proving the top level thing, then it's never actually going to take off. But hypothetically, if I don't think it's actually going to be this long, but if we had a 2-year, quarantine and everybody realized that, oh no, you actually can be like a top level performer in all these areas while having a fully online education, then I think some of that social, stigma would start to decline.
So tell me a little bit about what you've been working on recently. Preferably non-coronavirus related. Let's switch off the topic for a minute. Give us a break.
For sure. Yeah, so, as I mentioned, a lot of my work is on emerging technologies. I've done a fair bit of work on driverless cars. A lot of my work right now is on artificial intelligence, which is kind of a buzzword, but also useful as a descriptor of a whole category of technologies. I think that's one kind of mistake sometimes people have, is thinking of AI as this one undifferentiated grab bag, when really it's, it's very differentiated. It's a set of technologies that help improve human cognition and decision making across a broad range of characteristics, and then it's applied in very specific domains. And so there's a lot of hard policy work, saying, I don't think we need to regulate AI in the abstract, but you have all these areas where AI is now going into healthcare, criminal justice, transportation, education, and each of those areas has huge bodies of existing law that now you need to do the hard work of updating and saying, okay, now that we have these changes in how decisions are being made, how does that change the regulatory equilibrium? And so, it's an interesting area to be in, because at the one hand, it is very much like on the technological frontier, and you're seeing all of these interesting, new machine learning models and deep learning, neural nets and whatnot. But also a lot of the difficulties come when imbuing these very new technologically systems with very old world systems that have lasted for a long time, and processes have evolved and changed there that don't exactly match with the new technology is bringing.
So it's updating regulations, not necessarily like making new ones or getting rid of certain ones. It's kind of what's happening here.
Yeah, I think that's sort of how I think of it. I mean, probably in the process of updating it, you hopefully want to, get rid of a lot of stuff that doesn't make sense and maybe add some new rules that make sense. But I think it's a better starting point to say that, we already have de facto AI regulation across the entire economy, because anytime you have a very consequential physical or financial decision that has to be made, that's already regulated. And so now it's about updating what are the processes we're using as this new technology is coming into that. So I've done some work on the criminal justice side of things. I've done some work on the transportation side of things. That's really, what driverless cars are. It's, regular cars plus AI, and, machine vision and whatnot. And then I've also been kind of working on a broad set of policies to focus on stronger ecosystem effects. So because AI is so differentiated, if you can find small changes that increase the speed of AI diffusion or the pace of AI progress across all of those fields, then that can have really big long-running consequences. So the current paper I'm working on is on AI and immigration, talking about the fact that across all of these different ranges of AI, one of the biggest bottlenecks is just the lack of high-skilled, talented machine learning engineers. There's just not enough of them. And that's really, I think, the primary bottleneck right now, not only for technical progress on the frontier, but then also taking all of the new techniques that we have and then applying them across the economy. So both in terms of AI application and in AI development, there's, I think, talent is a huge bottleneck, and immigration is the single biggest source we have of new talent. Because if you look at our master's and PhD programs in STEM and related AI fields, 70% of them are international students. So just the vast majority of new AI talent being trained up are international students. And so then, the immigration system affects not only how competitive is the U.S. vis-a-vis China or Germany or other countries that are trying to develop their own AI ecosystems, but then also internally, Google, Amazon, Facebook competing with small AI startups. They have a huge advantage in terms of the immigration system, in terms of having those top minds want to apply there, because small startups are very disadvantaged. They don't have HR departments that are capable of braving the immigration bureaucracy in the same way that Amazon, Facebook, Google can. So I think it has both sort of, three things. One, you could increase the overall supply or the overall pace of innovation and diffusion in AI. Two, you could make the United States more competitive internationally vis-a-vis other countries that we're competing with. And three, you could help make startups more competitive vis-a-vis big companies domestically. all through this one lever of immigration reform.
So let's talk about what the problem is. So
Yeah.
why is there not a lot of high skilled immigration? I feel like there's almost this popular perception of like that America lets in these high skilled immigrants and does not let in low skilled immigrants. Is it true that we're letting in a lot of high skilled immigrants, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. So there's different ways of measuring this. If you look at overall numbers, we do let in quite a number. But if you look at compared to our population, so like number of foreign-born workers per native-born worker, we're actually much lower than a lot of our developed nation counterpoints. So Australia, Canada, the UK all have pretty substantially higher foreign-born populations than we do as a percentage of our population. So that's one way of thinking about it. The other thing is that the way the U.S. immigration system works is much more family reunification driven than other countries. So Australia and Canada in particular have point-based systems that are sort of explicitly trying to let in the best workers. But through sort of a weird set of quirks in the United States immigration system, we're primarily letting in sort of extended family members of workers that have already managed to get into the country, and that eats up most of our green card slots. And so
when we're saying extended
I think
family, do you mean like wife and children, or are we talking about like third cousin?
Yeah, it's more like I mean, there are wife and cousins coming in too, but other countries will typically let in, wives and siblings as well. It's more when you start to get to, more distant cousins, uncles, and extended family that the United States has an explicit policy in favor of that other countries don't have.
Someone just popped up with a question in the chat, and they asked on H1B1s. Any thoughts about switching from allocation by lottery to allocation by wage offered?
No, that's a great question. So that's one of the things I'm tackling in this paper I'm trying to finish up, which is sort of looking at the specific barriers in our immigration system that startups face. And one of the biggest ones is the randomness of the H-1B program. So for those who aren't familiar, the H-1B program is the primary pathway for a lot of skilled immigrants trying to stay in the country. And then once they get into the country, they can then apply for a green card or a longer term residency. But it's they only let in, I think, 80,000 H-1Bs a year, and it's allocated annually, I think, like in April. And within the first week of it being opened, you usually have 2 to 3 times as many applications as we have available slots. And so then, once if you meet a certain set of criteria, then you basically just go into a big lottery, and it's completely random who gets in, who doesn't. Which creates an element of uncertainty for workers. So if you're, graduating from a United States university, or you're trying to think about where do I want to move, where do I want to start my business, where do I want to do anything, uncertainty is a big deterrent, because even if you meet all of the qualifications, you could still be denied through pure chance. People assign I think roughly like a 60 to 70% chance that you'll be denied. So it's actually more likely than not, even if you meet all of the criteria. And that's much worse if you come from certain countries. So China and India have much, much longer wait periods than other countries, because we also have sort of diversity requirements, which is a whole other story. But because of that, it means that if you're from India, you're looking at a wait time that's longer than you will live on average. So so some people have recommended we could change that. We could go to some wage threshold instead, and basically say whoever's offering the highest salaries, they automatically get first priority, and then you just go in descending order there. And one advantage people point out that has is then there's less concern about United States or people using the H-1B to sort of try to cut wages for basically undercut U.S. wages by hiring a foreign worker, because then if you're going with the highest worker, then you're paying someone that's $800K, and there's very little likelihood that you're undercutting U.S. wage workers that way. One problem with that, though, is that does further give an incentive to large established companies that can afford to pay $800K for a machine learning engineer in a way that startups typically can't. In fact, you see that startups typically use equity as a major way of incentivizing domestic-based workers to come, work with them. Initially, they say, hey, we can't afford to offer you these enormous salaries that Google and Amazon can, but we can give you major equity in the company, and then if we're successful, you'll make lots of money. But that So I think if you were going to switch to that, I would want some sort of mechanism that also allows sort of stock offerings as a form of compensation, as a way of not disproportionately trying to incentivize workers. But in principle, I think it could be definitely a better system than the lottery.
And I don't want to pigeonhole this plan into like a certain partisan slot, but my appearance of it is like you're trying to create a plan that's almost going to have like bipartisan moderate support, that isn't like leaning too much into like Democratic ideology for immigration or Republican ideology for immigration. It's very much like, hi, if we want to expand immigration, this is a like moderate, pragmatic, evidence-driven way of really boosting that.
Yeah, I think so. It's certainly I think immigration broadly is like fairly agreed upon by economists as saying, these have broadly positive effects for both the receiving and the the leaving country, because you often have remittances that go back and help the country that they're leaving. But it is true that there is more I guess arguments about what is actually the net effect on the low wage side of the spectrum than there is on the high wage side. Personally, I'm very open. I would love to just increase immigration across the board. But I think if you're looking for where is there a more clear-cut case, then certainly high-skill immigration is what you would focus on. And if you, like me, are particularly focused on how can we push out the technological frontier, then having a bias in favor of high-skill workers is also helpful, because then you're actually letting in the computer scientists and the microbiologists and the whoever to help strengthen U.S. innovation clusters. And then I think the counterpoint is that low-skill immigration maybe has a greater humanitarian effect in the fact that these are people who, would in Honduras be making, 18 times less than they would in the United States, versus for a high-wage worker, their wage premium is less than that when coming to the United States. I think the counter argument to that would be that in sort of a dynamic ecosystem, if you can increase the rate of innovation, then that has huge global spillover effects that actually, lift everybody across the globe up. And so while it is true that in a narrow sense there might be larger humanitarian effects for letting in low-wage workers, I think you have better, long-run innovation effects that then, boost global GDP if you prioritize high-skill immigration.
And then just going back for a second, because I think this is a problem that we know exists, might not be like a popular perception, is like we allow a lot of students to come to the United States to study for their undergraduate degrees and their master's programs, but that doesn't ensure that they're going to be allowed to stay in the United States when their education's over. And there's this huge problem of like we will take students from China and India and like give them an education in machine learning, and they are like highly trained, highly skilled, can do excellent work, and then we're like, okay, go back to India because you didn't get a visa. Which seems like one, a waste of resources, but two, it's just like it's like a humanitarian disaster in my mind.
No, it totally is. I mean, you're taking a population that is spending oftentimes 4 or more years in like American cultural institutions, like these are usually very highly educated, highly adjusted to American culture by the time you lived here for 4 years or longer, and then saying, no, you can't stay here, please leave after we've helped you develop all of this, huge amount of human capital that could be used productively here, and then we're turning them away. I think part of the issue is that immigration on a legislative level tends to get all bundled. So if you want to make any change to even high skill immigration, it typically becomes inevitable that this is going to become part of a comprehensive immigration reform. And then you're just opening up the overall immigration, political sinkhole, and then you never make any progress. And so even if in principle, I think both parties would be broadly amenable to trying to let more high skill immigrants that have come here through, graduate programs in machine learning or whatnot stay in the United States, in practice, it kind of gets pushed down the political priority list because it inevitably gets bundled with this issue of broad comprehensive immigration, which is why I think one area that is underleveraged and I'm trying to do some work on is finding executive reforms. I think one thing Stephen Miller of the Trump administration has shown is that there is a great deal of leniency in terms of how you can enforce various kinds of immigration proposals purely on the executive level. And so he's used that to massively ramp up, denial rates in terms of, EB-1 visas and green cards and all sorts of things. But you could hypothetically use a lot of that same discretion to increase immigration without requiring Congress to act. And so I'm in sort of one of my papers, I'm trying to outline what are conceivable ways there.
Interesting. Any clues based on your research so far? What we can do at the EO level?
Yeah. So One program I'm particularly excited about is something called the O1 visa, which is sometimes called the Genius visa. It's supposed to be for immigrants of extraordinary ability. It has a green card equivalent, which is the EB1, and both of them rely on this extraordinary ability is sort of what the thing is supposed to be. But what's interesting about the O1 is that it's a completely uncapped program. So unlike the H-1B or almost every other program, there's no statutory cap set by Congress that says you can only let in X number of people in per year. And the other thing is that it's very discretionary. So this was part of like a 1990 immigration reform bill. And in it, they added in this category of O1 workers. And so in statute, all that's written is it's supposed to be for immigrants of extraordinary ability who showed sustained national or international acclaim. Now, that's pretty broad, and USCIS has then written regulations that outline 8 different criteria, and if you can show you meet 3 of them, then that's shown to demonstrate extraordinary ability, and you can come into the country on a 3-year renewing visa. But in practice, it tends to be a very, very high bar that they judge very highly. There was a story that came out recently that showed that there was an actual Nobel Prize winner who had their visa denied the first 3 times that they applied because they're being so strict in terms of the criteria here. But because they're so broadly written, you could hypothetically have a new USCIS director rewrite a bunch of the internal guidance to basically say, hey, we're trying to be more lax about this. We're trying to let in a larger cross-section of really talented individuals and pretty substantially increase the number of high-skilled workers in the United States that come on that program. So that's what I'm particularly interested in.
So could the guidelines be changed? I mean, I have no idea what the guidelines are. Could you theoretically say, like, oh, you don't have to win a Nobel Prize, but if you win your high school science competition, you can come to the United States?
Yes. So the 8 criteria are regulations, not in legislation. So you can have USCIS have new rulemaking to change those 8 criteria. Now, the criteria are pretty broad. They're like, have won a major award in your field, have made a substantial, significant contribution to your field, have major people in your field, write you a letter of recommendation saying that you are, a person of extraordinary means in your field. They're sort of like very broadly written like that, which means that I think, you could either change the criteria, add new ones, or, maybe reduce it from 3 to 2 in terms of how many you actually need to meet to get in. Or, again, you could just rewrite internal guidance in terms of how these 8 criteria are adjudicated and make it clear that we're trying to let in way more people. Now, I think the broader you write them or the broader you enforce them, the more you open yourselves up to legal challenge saying that, no, you're not actually letting in people of extraordinary ability. But I think the courts have shown pretty broad discretion to the executive in terms of the adjudication of these, and whether you're defining extraordinary ability as the top 0.1% of a field or the top 1% or the top 5% or the top 10%, like I think you could make reasonable cases that each of those is extraordinary ability, and so why choose to do 0.01 when you couldn't choose to do 5 or 10%?
Yeah, at the very least, it's worth trying to bring to court.
Yeah.
Like as the Trump administration has shown, they've gotten some pushback from the courts on their immigration stuff, but a lot more stuff has gone through, and the courts have only like partially struck down parts of the immigration regulations.
Yeah, so that's one I would look at. The other that I think could be particularly promising is there's a program called I'm probably gonna mess up the acronym. So it's OPT, optional practitioner training, something like that. It's basically an extension visa that students can get after they finish up at US universities that lets them stay in the United States for a couple of years while they try to find work. And then there's a STEM extension for that, so you can stay in for an extra couple of years if you have been working in a STEM field. But the Trump administration is becoming more bureaucratic about approving that and trying to increase the thresholds about what you actually need to prove before you can get that extension. And so again, I think that's another area where you could just say, hey, we're going to undo a lot of the negative stuff that's happened in the last couple of years and make it easier for high school students to stay in the United States.
Gotcha. So I guess this then ties back to what we're kind of experiencing with the coronavirus right now, of there's definitely I think even before this happened, we knew there was a shortage of healthcare workers. We have a shortage of nurses in America. We have a shortage of doctors, and that's partially driving the extremely high prices we see in our country. How does high skilled immigration play into that? And then we could even go back and tie that into AI and tech policy in general. I mean, there's a lot of really great emerging tech around teledoctor and telehealthcare. How all these parts really go together?
Yeah, I think certainly, a high skill immigration system, you would want it to have, some priority for, established doctors. I know one thing that some people have been playing around with as a proposal is sort of the idea similar, actually, so we've seen in coronavirus that they've been loosening the occupational licensing on healthcare workers and saying, oh, if you've already been licensed in Massachusetts, now you're free to work in Oregon if you want, which seems pretty sensical. I can't imagine that there's, huge differences in the training across those states, or that it would be necessary. You could do sort of a similar thing and say hey, if you have been approved to work as a doctor in, this list of highly developed industrialized countries that we approve of their medical practicing of, then you have license to work here, and we'll give you priority immigration access. There's also an exemption that the Department of Labor has called Schedule A, which is supposed to be for occupations in particularly high demand. And if you can get your occupation put on Schedule A, then you get priority access. You get, a lot of the bureaucratic hurdles of the immigration system waived for you. This is a pretty little known, little used exemption right now. It's only physical therapists and nurse practitioners who are on it. But you could, conceivably expand that out a lot wider, especially in a time of coronavirus, when we need a lot more doctors and medical health professionals. So yeah, get them on Schedule A, help them get into the country more quickly. But I think this also kind of gets back into why do we care that these people are in the United States in particular? If they're helping produce innovations, in their home countries, that's great too. We can benefit from that, which I think kind of gets back to the effect of amalgamation effects and innovation clusters, and the fact that there are particular geographical locations where people can be much more productive. And in particular, if you can get a bunch of smart people into the same geographical area where they're bouncing ideas off of each other and in competition with each other, then the sum is greater than its parts. And so I think that's a particular reason why I sort of think of the United States sometimes as playing the role of the research and development lab for the world. We have a particular business climate. We have a particular entrepreneurial spirit. We have a particular culture that can assimilate immigrants very well compared to a lot of other countries, that I think makes us very well suited to be kind of the provider of the global public good of more innovation. And so I think it's particularly important for the United States to welcome, these best and brightest people from all over the world to come to the United States, produce these innovations, live in our, innovation hubs, push out the technological frontier, and then the rest of the world can benefit.
Which is the benefit of a globalized economy of we can develop all these technological innovations in America, and then the rest of the world can share in them, which makes this whole thing about stealing talent away from other countries almost I want to call it a fake scandal, but it's almost like fear mongering when there's not really a danger there. If we're taking engineers from China, there's an argument really that everyone is better off because of that, including China, because we have highly skilled engineers working in the best tech cluster in the world.
Yep. Now, I would say, I think the other argument that's sort of different, it's almost a national security argument, but it's a little bit different, is the idea that also the country where a lot of these systems are built has particular soft power to sort of build in certain kinds of cultural values or build out certain kind of cultural values in their platforms in a way that you can't if you're not building those. So we've seen recently, there was an article that came out, I think today or yesterday, looking at TikTok and the fact that the Chinese government has been effectively ordering their moderators to try to keep ugly and poor people out of the algorithm to a degree, because they're wanting to make it more appealing to new users, and to also silence political dissidents and whatnot. And as much as you might have problems with Google or Facebook's, content moderation, I think we can all agree that it's nowhere near that level. And so there's a certain extent to the fact that U.S. technology companies are building into their platforms a greater degree of broadly, Enlightenment liberal values in a way that I think we can't particularly expect from China. And so that's kind of another reason I think why it might be particularly important for the United States to make sure that we're leading in a lot of these knowledge clusters and trying to push out the technological frontier, because it gives us a much greater ability to sort of shape the norms and ethics and regulations of these technologies as they go forward. Which is, I guess, then the other point would be that you can only regulate technologies that are actually in your borders. So, China has been a lot more experimental in genetic editing than the United States has. And so you've seen that, regardless of what American genetic ethicists think, like China is pushing forward on genetic modification regardless of what we think, right? We have no ability, or very limited ability, to actually control or influence how that develops. And so that would be, I guess, a third reason if you actually want to shape the long-term norms and ethics of these technologies, they have to be within your borders in the first place to influence them.
Yeah, and I feel like this is like a very DC insiders thing, but I feel like DC very much cares about like 5G rollout and Huawei and all that kind of stuff. And I feel like none of the rest of the country cares about that, which is perfectly fine because it's very boring. But the conversation you always have about Huawei is like, we don't want them to be leading the 5G rollout because they might be putting Chinese spyware and Chinese values and censoring into this hardware that we're going to deploy around the country and essentially control most of our telecommunications infrastructure.
Yeah.
Which is why then you get people like Josh Hawley, I think it was, and Tom Cotton were the people really pioneering of like, we should be nationalizing and really creating like a cluster of telecommunications hardware that's built in the United States so we can ensure that it's not spyware or censoring routing traffic back to China kind of stuff. I have no idea what the merits of those arguments are. Maybe you can speak to them a little bit if that's something you feel comfortable with. But it's definitely been like an interesting thing because everyone in DC really cares about it, and then you like leave DC by like a foot, and everyone's like, "What the fuck are you talking about?"
I'll talk mostly in sort of broad generalities about this because 5G and broadband is not my particular area of expertise. So take this all for a grain of salt. I think it's certainly the case that there are a lot of troubling aspects, especially if sort of given free reign to build these infrastructure systems without any sort of oversight, then that's particularly troubling. And yeah, you could have all sorts of spyware and privacy issues. I think, for certain kinds of critical infrastructure issues, there is maybe a national security argument for wanting, a U.S. company to be building out at least some of this or be part of those conversations. I think you could also maybe have like a third way, which would be you agree that Huawei can build certain parts of the infrastructure so long as they have open sourced like all of the aspects of their algorithmic programming of like how they're doing network management, and they've given us the schematics about the kinds of infrastructure they're actually building, and then you allow U.S. testing to make sure that they're building what they say they are testing or building. And so maybe there's a deploy but verify sort of middle ground that might still allow Huawei to have some portion of it, but certainly there's need for skepticism to make sure going on there.
Yeah, and that's like totally something I am not qualified to speak about, but I really, again, like I cannot go into like a meeting or talk to someone in DC without them talking about 5G rollout, and it's just like right over my head when that stuff comes up. But no, I guess like now going back to what we were talking about with like technology clusters. So like we're talking about healthcare and like how this stuff is all happening, and then I think there was like the news, it might have been yesterday, about the German government was like, yeah, Trump is trying to poach our researchers, and that was like a whole big scandal, which I thought was interesting. I don't want to have like a hot take on like whether that's good or not in like a pandemic.
Yeah. I
just was like, oh, I understand what he's doing with that. Like he's trying to get all the researchers into the United States like now instead of instead of later, I guess. But
no, it's interesting. I don't know if I'd seen the German one in particular, but yeah, this whole coronavirus thing has certainly been an interesting maybe proxy for where are the most developed biotechnology hubs across the world. So you've seen, there's Germans teams that have been developing this. Israel has been making a lot of noises about, getting close to a vaccine or some sort of development on, actual prevention of coronavirus. I have no expertise at all to actually, investigate the veracity of those claims, but it's interesting certainly that they're getting attention, that they're making noise in that. I know that there's also been U.S. testing now of vaccine development. It seems like we're much slower in a lot of our regulatory processes for approving, things like new vaccine development, which seem particularly ill-suited for this climate when you need sort of a fast response if you're going to have one. But I think maybe the idea of trying to, like, I don't know, poach researchers is interesting. It might be ineffective this late in the game. Like, I don't know if you can just take a German scientist who's already been deeply embedded in the culture and the companies and the academic conversation happening in Germany, just plop them into Silicon Valley and hope that they're, making something cool. There's probably like an adjustment period, and maybe that's why it's a good reason to be investing in the strength of these clusters before crises happen, because then, you have a greater ability to rely on them after the fact. There's another piece, though, which is there is an interesting element of international competition over this top talent from all over. So the United Kingdom a couple of months ago announced that they're totally overhauling their high-skill immigration proposal. So it was called the Tier 1 program. Now it's called Global Talent Visa. And basically, they moved from a 2,000-a-year program to an uncapped visa that's trying to attract as many of these top engineers and talented entrepreneurs as they can, and make it pretty explicit, like, hey, this sort of population of global entrepreneurs, we want you to come to the UK. We want you to develop your tools here. We want you to go to school here, and then develop cool things for us. And you've seen Israel has started going so far as like paying Israeli companies to develop new AI scientists because they recognize that there's such a shortage. China has this huge program called the 1,000 Talents Plan, where they're actively trying to recruit Chinese students or Chinese professors that are currently in U.S. universities and tell them to come back to China. They'll say, hey, we'll give you, tons of research funding for free. We'll give you free room and board, anything you need. Like, let's get you to China and get you working on these things. So I would say that in the past, the United States has sort of been the de facto winner of a lot of this global talent, kind of on accident. Like, we've been coasting. We just kind of had the best ecosystem, and that kind of had an inertia effect, and people wanted to move here. And other countries were not being deliberate about trying to poach that talent. And so there's a great book called The Gift of Global Talent by William Kerr, which has a fantastic graph in it that goes from 2000 to 2010, and it looks at the population of immigrant inventors, so people who left their country who had a patent, and you can see that the United States had more of these people immigrate to the United States than the rest of the world combined, which is amazing. But I certainly think that graph is not going to look the same in 2010 to 2020 or 2020 to 2030 unless we start making serious efforts. Partially because we have more immigration restrictions than we did in 2000, but also because there's more opportunities available overseas to actually develop tech companies or work on the cutting edge of some research field. And so I think the combination of those two things means that if we actually want to keep being the home for a lot of these most talented people, we're actually going to have to start trying. We can no longer just continue coasting on our laurels. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of a whole another interesting dynamic of the fact is that, there's increasing global competition over this talent because people are starting to recognize the huge economic impacts that it can have.
No, I mean, this could probably be a conversation for a whole other hour, but what is the reason why the United States for the longest time was like the leader in like getting all this high skilled talent, developing these clusters? There's probably not a precise answer to this, so whatever your best guess is or your general answer is, but I think there's been a lot of questioning, especially by like people like Tyler Cowen and Patrick Collison, of like why does the U.S. really push progress happening, and like why are we getting this slowdown nowadays? That's
a great question, and as you mentioned, there is no one correct answer to this. I think it's a whole amalgamation of factors. I think one of them is basically the effects of World War I, World War II, and the Holocaust. So in the late 1800s, early 1900s, you could argue that a lot of these knowledge tech clusters, science clusters, were in Austria, in Germany, sort of Austro-Hungarian Empire. There's a lot of the Nobel Prizes of the time, and the people who eventually won Nobel Prizes kind of came from that area. There were a lot of the knowledge and tech clusters there. But then through the destruction of World War I, World War II, both scientists looking to flee the war and move to a more welcoming place, a lot of them moved to the United States, which was kind of like the up-and-coming place at the time. And at the time that they were fleeing, we weren't in the war. And then also the combination of after Germany fell, there was a pretty concentrated effort to attract a lot of this talent, in some cases forcibly conscript them, called Operation Paperclip. So basically, during the height of the Cold War, we were trying to prevent a lot of these top German scientists from going to the Soviet Union and instead come to the United States. And so part of this was, attracting them. There were a couple of cases of like forced kidnapping, which you probably don't want to replicate. But
Wow.
it's kind of a crazy time. But and to be clear, like a lot of these people weren't exactly like good people either. Like some of them were, former Nazi scientists or whatnot. But there were a lot of them that were just kind of, forced into to the regime and were kind of doing their work. But when they came to the United States, there was a pretty large explosion in science. Werner von Braun created the Saturn V rocket, and a lot of the sort of NASA progress of that time happened from some of the scientists we got from Operation Paperclip. And so that kind of the combination of world wars and scientists fleeing that, combined with Operation Paperclip, was a huge influx of international scientific and technical talent into the United States. That happened right at the time that we were having a huge economic boom, building out a middle class that was now demanding new, products. We had tons of investment in areas like Silicon Valley, which then eventually sort of created the sparks of of the knowledge clusters in those areas. Combined with an up-and-coming university system. So I think it was kind of the combination of all those factors happened to sort of come together at the right time. And we've kind of been coasting off of the effects of that.
Is there any sign that another country is really getting its shit together and developing this cluster like the United States did back in the 50s?
Yeah, so certainly China is trying to be deliberate about creating these clusters. You didn't hear like as much talk about this, in the 1950s. It kind of just like happened. I mean, certainly there were some people that were aware of it and trying to be deliberate in the formation of it. But I think it's in the forefront of national policy in a way that it wasn't in the 1950s, maybe. China has these huge elaborate plans where they're very deliberately trying to get top scientists all living in sort of close quarters, working off each other, competing with each other, and pushing out the frontier on like hypersonic missile development and artificial general intelligence and whatnot. There's a lot of noise, and it's hard to always assess like how successful are they actually being in some of those things. But certainly they have more tech clusters and semiconductors. They've been pretty successful with. Whether they can sustain those long term is another question. One of the things that China has in their favor is they just have a huge population. In a way that we don't, and they have been pretty deliberate about trying to do talent selection. Trying to like at very early ages suss out who's doing the best on all these various standardized tests, and then pushing them upwards towards more advanced universities and academies. And then once they're there, getting them enrolled either like in governmental roles or pushing them to become research scientists in a way that's a bit more laissez-faire in the United States. Of course, that has also the trade-offs. United States people have a lot more freedom to like pursue their own careers and whatnot in a way that they don't in China. But I think, honestly, our superpower is the fact that we can assimilate immigrants in a way that China can't. China is mostly trying to claw back the researchers and students that are Chinese nationals from U.S. universities. Like, that's the population they're attracting because they have a very homogenous population. But the United States has for a long time been like the melting pot of the world's technical practitioners and researchers. And that's kind of a superpower that maybe only like Australia and Canada and maybe the UK could rival in terms of our ability to assimilate immigrants and mix them into American culture. So I think that's sort of the main advantage that China and the US has. But I think in the long run, I would still bet on the US. But unfortunately, we keep shooting ourselves in the foot.
Yeah, no, I mean, is the Chinese question of like why people aren't immigrating there a supply or demand problem? Is like China saying like we do not want like non-Chinese people coming into the country to be researchers? Do people just not want to go to China because of the government structure that's currently there? Or do we just like not know why this hasn't happened? Because I mean, you're right, because it's like the technological innovation that's happened in the United States has been driven by immigrants coming from Europe and China and India and Africa and all these different continents coming together. Like we just had Stephen Hamilton on, who was an economist who got his PhD at Michigan, but is from Australia. Why isn't China attracting these international researchers like we are?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think they are trying to, on the margin, but I don't know. I think a lot of it is sort of like America was, as the cliche goes, like a nation of immigrants. Like, right, we were founded in a way that brought people from very disparate parts of the world together and made a cohesive cultural cloth out of that. And so it is woven like a bit deeper into our DNA that we can assimilate immigrants in a way that China can't. I won't pretend to be like an expert and like, say, oh, here are the 3 reasons why China, can't assimilate immigrants in the way that we can. But it certainly seems like we've just been doing it for a lot longer. And I think these broad cultural factors end up shaping, these effects maybe even more than like national policies do. And so, for all China is investing in AI and quantum computing and whatnot, they may make some progress, but the fact that they can't seem to assimilate immigrants in the same way that we can, I think, is a big disadvantage that they have.
So really, the issue here is like if China was good, they would have a lot of technological superpower, but because China is bad, no one wants to go there, so they don't have the technological innovation that we currently do.
Yeah, I think it's part of it. There's also like when what is it called? I forget, there's some colloquial name for it, but when the metric becomes the goal, it ceases to be a useful goal or something like that, which you see a lot of. China has a weird mix of like actually interesting like commercial developments being driven by the commercial sector combined with like top-down central planning goals about we want to have X quota be met. And even in principle, maybe that sounds like a good thing, but then it ceases to be. Like a favorite example of mine is I forget the exact number, but they had some goal about we want to produce like 67 different AI textbooks in the next like 5 years. And they did that, but why do you need 67 different AI textbooks, right? Like if it's a good textbook, it should be good enough to just have one to roll out everywhere. I think that there can be some odd things like that too. Or Chinese companies tend to perform well on various like AI performance like international competitions because it's been made clear that if you can successfully win these competitions, you have huge like national acclaim within China. You'll be like showered with resources from the Chinese government to like make that happen. Again, like they'll just give you tons of money and cultural fame, and will also like give you lots and lots of money to buy the processing power necessary to try to win this algorithmic race. But it's unclear whether they can actually match us in terms of like commercially useful deployments of a lot of these technologies, because the incentives aren't exactly aligned for that in the same way that they are in the United States.
Well, quickly before we wrap up, I will open the chat to questions and see if any pour in. But do you have any like closing on related coronavirus takes from today? The news is like moving so fast that like my takes 24 hours ago are no longer relevant. Yeah. I'm curious if you've had any like good realizations today.
I don't know. I think the realization seems to be coming to people that this is going to be a longer process than people thought. Like a lot of the initial warnings were like, keep out, work from home until April or something. And now it seems to be increasingly likely that is not going to be the end of it. And we could be seeing a much longer period of social distancing and self-quarantining and whatnot. Now, obviously, you don't want to make formal predictions because, 1 or 2 variables could be slightly off and that could have very different, effects in either direction. But I think as the period of social distancing continues to increase, I will just be very curious to see what happens in terms of the rise of remote work, the rise of higher education online. And then maybe also the other thing I've been thinking about today is whether or not flexibility in manufacturing supply chains will continue to become a more important thing in the future. So it seems like through a combination of maybe future global pandemics or climate change leading to more natural disasters or economic upheavals in various ways, because our international global supply chains are a lot more interconnected than maybe they used to be, that also means that they're more brittle. And that, if you have a bunch of production all concentrated in one area and then the area goes down and now it's very difficult for you to produce that same good, that poses like certain kinds of risks and harms both to society and to businesses. And so I suspect that in the next decade, you'll see one important margin of innovation in manufacturing will be flexibility, or to what degree, if you have production shut down in one location, can you now ramp it up in another location fairly seamlessly? And so one way that could look like is massive increases in advanced manufacturing, whether that be 3D printing or injection printing or other things that basically the way I'm sort of imagining it is you had one of the big industrial revolution changes was interchangeable parts, where you could have a gun and you could switch out the gears and plug in new ones and it worked just as well, and that was like a major boon both for production and for the efficiency of a lot of these systems. You could almost imagine the same thing on like the platform tool side of things. So if you have a set of widely used manufacturing machines through which you can make almost anything that fits certain kinds of specifications or uses certain kinds of materials. If that's broadly known then you'll see product designers design their products so that they fall within those broad specifications, and then that gives them a surety that, oh, I can design this chain of products and know that if manufacturing gets shut down in one location, I can easily shift it to another. So again, I'm not a manufacturing expert. I could be wildly off base, but I think that's another thing I've been thinking about.
Well, fascinating. Well, Caleb, thank you so much for coming on. This is great. And if this quarantine continues, I'll have to bring you on some other time to talk more tech policy.
Sounds good.
All right. Have a good one.
You too.